The Grey King by Susan Cooper. 1. The Golden Harp. Eyes that see the wind. They stood silent in the dim-lit darkness. Somewhere out beyond the rock, thunder still rumbled and growled. The torches burned, flickering and smoky on the walls. Bran said huskily, "Was he the—" "No," Merriman said. "He is not the Grey King, but he is one very close to him. And back to him he has gone. And their rage will mount higher, will mount the higher because it will be sharpened by fear. Fear at what the light may be able to do with this new thing of power." He looked at Will, his bony face tight with concern. "The first perilous part of the quest is accomplished, old one, but there is worse peril yet to come." "The sleepers must be wakened," Will said. "That is right, and although we do not yet know where they sleep, nor shall till you have found them, it is almost certain that they are terribly, dangerously close to the Grey King. For long we have known there was reason for his hard, cold grip on this part of the land, though we did not understand it. A happy valley this has always been, and beautiful, yet he chose to make his kingdom here, instead of in some grim, remote place of the kind chosen by most of his line. Now it is clear there can be only one reason for that, to be close to the place where the sleepers lie, and to keep their resting place within his power, just as this great rock, Creg Ardian, is still within his power." Will said, his round face grave, "The spell of protection by which we came here untouched has run its course now, and it can be made only once." He looked ruefully at Bran. "We may have an interesting reception out there when we leave this place." "Have no care, old one. You will have a new protection with you now." The words came deep and gentle from the top of the hall. Turning, Will saw that the bearded lord, his robe blue as the summer sea, was sitting enthroned again in the shadows. As he spoke, it seemed that the light began gradually to grow in the hall. The torches burned higher and glimmering. Between them now, Will could see long swords hanging on the stone. "The music of the Golden Harp," said the blue-robed lord, "has a power that may not be broken either by the dark or by the light. It has the high magic in it, and while the harp is being played, those under its protection are safe from any kind of harm or spell. Play the harp of gold, old one. Its music will wrap you in safety." Will said slowly, "By enchantment I could play it, but I think it should rather be played by the art of skillful fingers. I do not know how to play the harp, my lord." He paused. "But Bran does." Bran looked down at the instrument as Will held it out to him. "Never a harp like that, though," he said. He took the harp from Will. Its frame was slender but ornate, fashioned so that a golden vine with gold leaves and flowers seemed to twine round it, in and out of the strings. Even the strings themselves looked as if they were made of gold. "Play, Bran," said the bearded lord softly. Holding the harp experimentally in the crook of his left arm, Bran ran his fingers gently over the strings, and the sounds that came from them were of such sweetness that Will beside him caught his breath in astonishment. He had never heard notes at once so delicate and so resonant, filling the hall with music like the liquid bird-song of summer. Intent, fascinated, Bran began to pick out the plaintive notes of an old Welsh lullaby, elaborating it gradually, filling it out as he gained confidence in the feel of the strings under his one hand. Will watched the absorbed musician's devotion on his face. Glancing for an instant at the enthroned lord and at Merriman, he knew that they too were for this moment rapt, carried away out of time by a music that was not of the earth, pouring out like the high magic in a singing spell. Cathal made no sound but leaned his head against Bran's knee. Merriman said, his deep voice soft over the music, "Go now, old one." His shadowed, deep-set eyes met Will's briefly in a fierce communication of trust and hope. Will stared about him for a long moment at the high torchlit hall, with its one dark-robed figure standing tall as a tree, and the unknown bearded lord seated motionless on his throne. Then he turned and led Bran, his fingers still gently plucking a melody from the harp, toward the narrow stone staircase to the chamber from which they had come. When he had set him climbing, he turned to raise one arm in salute, then followed. Bran stood in the stone room above, playing, while Cathal and Will came up after him, and as he played there took shape in the blank wall at the end of the chamber below the single hanging golden shield, the two great doors through which they had come into the heart of Bird Rock. The music of the harp rippled in a lilting upward scale, and slowly, slowly the doors swung inward. Beyond they saw the grey, cloudy sky between the steep walls of the cleft of rock. Though the fire blazed no longer on the mountain, a strong dead smell of burning hung in the air. As they stepped outside, Cathal bounded out past them, through the cleft, and disappeared. Struck suddenly by a fear of losing him again, Bran stopped playing. "Cathal! Cathal!" he called. "Look," said Will softly. He was half-turned, looking back. Behind them the tall slabs of rock swung silently together and seemed to melt out of existence, leaving only a weathered rock face, looking just as it had looked for thousands of years, and in the air hung a faint vanishing phrase of delicate music. But Bran was thinking only of Cathal. After one brief glance at the rock, he tucked the harp beneath his arm and dived for the opening through which the dog had disappeared. Before he could reach it, a whirling flurry of white came hurtling in upon them through a cloud of fine ash, snarling, kicking, knocking Bran sideways so hard he almost dropped the harp. It was Cathal, but a mad, furious, transformed Cathal, growling at them, glaring, driving them deeper into the cleft, as if they were enemies. In a moment or two he had them pinned, astounded, against the rocky wall, and was crouching before them, with his long side teeth bared in a cold snarl. "What is it?" said Bran blankly, when he had breath enough to speak. "Cathal, what on earth?" And in an instant they knew, or would have known if they had had time still for wondering, for suddenly the whole world round them was a roaring flurry of noise and destruction. Broken, charred branches came whirling past over the top of the rocky cleft. Stones came bounding down loose out of nowhere, so that instinctively they ducked, covering their heads. They fell flat on the ground, pressing themselves into the angle between earth and rock, with Cathal close beside. All around the wind howled and tore at the rock with a sound like a high, mad human scream, amplified beyond belief. It was as if all the air in Wales had funneled down into a great tornado of tearing destruction, and was battering in a frenzy of frustrated rage at the narrow opening in whose shelter they desperately crouched. Will lurched up on his hands and knees. He groped with one hand until he clutched Bran's arm. "The harp!" he croaked. "Play the harp!" Bran blinked at him, dazed by the noise overhead. Then he understood, forcing himself up against the fearsome wind pressing him between the rocky walls. He gripped the golden harp against his side and ran his hand tremulously over the strings. At once the tumult grew less. Bran began to play, and as the sweet notes poured out like the song of a lark rising, the great wind died away into nothing. Outside there was only the rattle of loose pebbles tumbling here and there, one by one, down the rock. For a moment the lone sunbeam slanted down and glinted on the gold of the harp. Then it was gone, and the sky seemed duller, the world more grey. Cathal scrambled to his feet, licked Bran's hand, and led them docilely out to the slope outside the narrow cleft that had sheltered them from the fury of the gale. They felt the soft rain beginning to fall. Bran let his fingers wander idly but persistently over the strings of the harp. He had no intention of stopping again. He looked at Will and shook his head mutely with wonder and remorse and inquiry all in one. Will squatted down and took Cathal's muzzle between his hands. He shook the dog's head gently from side to side. "Cathal, Cathal," he said wonderingly. Over his shoulder he said to Bran, "Gwent, trad, Imurl." Is that how you say it? It's all its ancient force. The Grey King sent his north wind upon us, the wind that blows round the feet of the dead, and with the dead is where we should have been if it weren't for Cathal, blasted away into a time beyond tomorrow, before we could have seen a single tree bending. It would have been on us, for it came down from very high up, and no human-sighted eye could have seen it. But this hound of yours is the dog with the silver eyes, and such dogs can see the wind. So he saw it, and knew what it would do, and drove us back to safety. Bran said guiltily, If I hadn't stopped playing, perhaps the Brenton Lude couldn't even have sent the wind. The magic of the harp would have stopped him. Perhaps, Will said, and perhaps not. He gave Cafal's head one last rub and straightened up. The white sheepdog looked at Bran, tongue-lolling as if in a grin, and Bran said to him lovingly, Root, tie and gather, good boy. But still his fingers did not stop moving over the harp. Slowly they scrambled down the rock. Though it was full morning now, the sky was no lighter, but grey and heavy with cloud. The rain was still light, but it was clear that it would grow and settle in for the day, and that the valley was safe now from any more threat of fire. All the near slope of the mountain, Bird Rock and the valley edge were blackened and charred, and here and there wisps of smoke still rose. But the sparks were drowned now, and the ashes cold and wet, and the green farmlands would not again this year be in any state for burning. Bran said, Did the harp bring the rain? I think so, Will said. I am just hoping it will bring nothing else. That's the trouble with the high magic, like talking in the old speech. It's a protection, and yet it marks you, makes you easy to find. We'll be in the valley soon. But as he spoke, Bran's foot slipped on a wet rock face, and he stumbled sideways, grabbing at a bush to save himself from falling, and dropped the harp. In the instant that the music broke off, Cafal's head jerked up, and he began barking furiously in a mixture of rage and challenge. He jumped up on the projecting rock, and stood poised there, staring about him. Then suddenly the barking broke into a furious deep howl, like the baying of a hunting dog, and he leapt. The great grey fox, king of the Milgwyn, swerved in midair and screamed like a vixen. In a headlong rush down Bird Rock, he had sprung out at them from above, aiming straight for Bran's head and neck, but the shock of Cafal's fierce leap turned his balance just enough to send him spinning sideways, cartwheeling down the rock. He screamed again, an unnatural sound that made the boys flinch in horror, and did not stop himself to turn at bay, but rushed on in a frenzy down the mountain. In an instant, Cafal's barking in joyous triumph was tearing down after him, and Will, up on the empty rock under the grey drizzling,